Above me is the English Electric Canberra, an aircraft that would be the RAF's longest serving machine and one that was designed to operate at high level. At the time of its introduction in 1951, it was an incredibly efficient aircraft. But by the late 1950s, everything changed. The Soviet Union brought into service brand new surface-to-air missiles, and suddenly, overnight, the Canberra was vulnerable. Now, the British government needed a new aircraft, one that could beat this threat and fly under the radar. Operational requirement 339 was extensive, requiring an aircraft capable of supersonic speeds, low-level performance, and carrying a nuclear weapon. It was a huge ask for the technology of the time, but had it been successful, the aircraft itself would have been a world beater, the best had seen. That aircraft is the aircraft behind me, the aircraft that never was, the BAC TSR-2.
It seemed to go through the air like an arrow.
If it had gone into service by 1975, it would still be in service today.
Britain in the 1950s was in a difficult position, financially struggling coming out of the Second World War, and that financial problem extended to the aircraft industry as well. In Britain, there were a huge number of independent aircraft companies. Previously sustained by a wartime economy, they were now struggling for a limited amount of lucrative government contracts. The government wanted these aircraft companies to consolidate or die.
The government decided that this would be too great a task for any one company, and it would only be undertaken on the basis of two of the strongest companies amalgamating together with a third company to produce the engine. There was a lot of resistance to that idea, but this was the only contract that was available in the military field, and it had to be considered that way.
So with this background, Vickers Armstrong, who include Supermarine, Bristol and English Electric, the company responsible for the early designs of this aircraft. These three aircraft companies took on the name BAC, the British Aircraft Corporation. As a result, parts of the aircraft were built by different parts of that larger organisation, with Vickers responsible for most of the front of the aircraft and English Electric in general the back section. Vickers were also responsible for the avionics in the aircraft and English Electric the aerodynamics. This was further complicated from the fact that Bristol Siddeley were responsible for the engines, and there were also numerous other subcontractors responsible for various smaller parts of the aircraft. This would have consequences further down the line as the aircraft began to come together.
It's a rather complicated situation with TSR-2. Everybody was doing their own thing down there. I mean, we had English Electric fitters, the engine people from Olympus looking after their bit, umpteen firms, if you will, all looking after their own little bit, but working in conjunction with each other, you know.
The design of TSR-2 was incredibly advanced, far in advance of anything in service with the RAF at the time, or indeed throughout the world. A key part of that would have been the terrain-following radar, allowing the aircraft to operate at extremely low altitudes, at high speed and with accuracy. And this was supplemented by the advent of a head-up display for both the pilot and rear crew member in the cockpit, allowing them to have a much better situational awareness of the aircraft in its surroundings. Those advanced design features continue throughout the rest of the aircraft. The specification for TSR-2 required it to take off from hastily prepared and short runways. As a result, TSR-2 would gain these massive undercarriage legs that kept the aircraft high off of the ground.
The role was tactical strike and reconnaissance, the sort of role that the Tornado carry out these days. There was a very large avionics bay behind the cockpit, which is really essential for low-flying aircraft that have to follow the terrain to stay under the enemy's radar.
To allow TSR-2 to operate at high supersonic speeds and at low level required the aircraft to have very small wings and high wing loading. Unfortunately, this meant that at slower speeds its handling was affected, meaning the engineers were required to install fully blown flaps. Engine exhaust blown across the control surfaces improved handling at slower speeds.
The idea was that you wanted an aircraft with an extremely low wing loading, so that when you're pounding along at low level, you don't feel the actual turbulence. As a weapon aiming platform, it can be made stable. But it was the sheer power from the two Olympuses which gave it its enormous performance capabilities, almost sinisterly powerful.
TSR-2 was designed to be powered by a pair of Bristol Siddeley Olympus engines. The engines would power the aircraft to twice the speed of sound, Mach 2. Early on, they caused a number of problems with the aircraft in its first test flight phase, but the engines were developed to become a success in Concorde. Towards the end of 1964, the aircraft had come together and was getting close to its first flight, something that was achieved in September of that year. But from the start, there were problems that would continue to arise throughout its early test process. Key amongst them were surrounding the undercarriage and the engines. The engine was an early trials version and wasn't rated for full power. The undercarriage itself on the first number of flights was not retracted due to various issues. However, by the 10th flight of TSR-2, a number of those early teething problems had been overcome, allowing the pilots to finally perform supersonic flights and, most importantly, low-level flights through the Pennines as well. By that 10th flight, the pilots flying this aircraft were starting to report how well TSR-2 handled and the fact that it flew beautifully. The team behind the aircraft finally began to think that they had a world-beating aircraft on their hands.
When you saw it in flight, that was a different kettle of fish altogether. I mean, it was absolutely magnificent. It seemed to go through the air like an arrow without any disturbance.
In 24 flights, we achieved such an incredible confirmation of its capabilities that we, the people who were on the job, could see no reason, no argument against it being perpetuated. We thought this airplane is actually going to do what it's intended to do.
But to get to this stage, costs were spiralling. Originally projected to cost between 15 and 35 million pounds in the money of the day, it was projected that by the end of 1965, costs would have risen to around about 125 million pounds, and the aircraft still wasn't ready for service. In the still difficult financial circumstances following the first flight of TSR-2, a new Labour government came into power in Britain, a government that were promising to make cuts. And with the ballooning costs of TSR-2, it was prime for the chopping board. And in the budget of April 65, the TSR-2 was dealt a death blow. At the very moment that TSR-2 was about to be cancelled, the second prototype was being readied for flight at Boscombe Down. The flight crew had adjourned to a local pub for lunch, and it was here that they heard the story of the cancellation of the project.
He heard it on the news, didn't even know about it, and he was due to fly the aircraft that afternoon. And he rushed back, I believe, to the airfield, and they said, that's it. Because they were going to try and get it up in the air before the knife fell.
Following the cancellation, the government looked abroad for a replacement and focused on the American F-111, an aircraft under development at the time and that would have a potentially similar performance to TSR-2. Only two now survive, one of which, the fourth prototype to be built, is our aircraft here, XR-222.
The cost effectiveness was the argument that was used against it, but they didn't realise that the change from subsonic military aviation to supersonic military aviation was going to up the costs. To get an airplane to go from the subsonic regime to the supersonic regime, you've got to overcome this vertical drag rise that occurs with the compressibility of air from 80% of the speed of sound up to the speed of sound. That costs money, and people didn't realise that then.
In the end, the British government ended up not purchasing the American F-111. As a result of experience gained by the Australians who did purchase it, they find that the costs would have been even higher than those projected for TSR-2. Instead, the RAF would have to make do with a number of different aircraft types to fulfil the role that one aircraft potentially could have done by itself, aircraft such as the Buccaneer and Jaguar. That was until the 1980s, when in collaboration with the Germans and Italians, the RAF would introduce the Panavia Tornado to service.
If the TSR-2 had gone into service, it would have been an airplane that had a considerably longer unrefueled range than a Tornado. It would have done the Tornado's tactical work with terrain following radar and all the rest of it, and it would have had a 2.5 Mach capability at altitude, which is faster than the Tornado, and that's 30 years later.
The story behind TSR-2 is full of contested narratives, both from political and economic backgrounds and from the people who operated and built the aircraft as well. It was an advanced aircraft, probably too advanced for the economic climate in Britain at the time. Although the project itself was cancelled, the lessons learnt from it were not wasted, both in terms of the technology that went into the aircraft, that found its way into future projects, and the ability for these companies to work together that would set the seeds for the future of the British aircraft industry. I think the failure of the TSR-2 project is best summed up by Sir Sidney Cann, designer of the Hawker Hurricane, when he stated that all modern aircraft have 4 dimensions: span, length, height and politics. With TSR-2, they only got the first 3 right.